Welcome everybody to this 25th Nigel Walker lecture. My name is Manuel Eisner. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director currently of the Institute of Criminology, and I'll lead you through this event. Just briefly by way of background, the Nigel Walker lecture was inaugurated in 1997. It's named in honor of the Institute's second director, Nigel Walker of King's College, who served as Wolfson Professor of Criminology from 1973 to 1984. The annual lecture is given, and you can see this here, by an eminent criminologist. It's the most prestigious, most important annual event organized by the Institute of Criminology, showcasing important theoretical, empirical achievements across the entire discipline and engaging with these developments across the disciplines. As always, the Nigel Walker Lecture is also the moment for the award of the Nigel Walker Prize for an outstanding PhD thesis completed by a PhD student of the Institute. This year, the winner of the Nigel Walker Prize for the best PhD dissertation is Laura Kennedy, who is sitting here. The title of her thesis, submitted in 2022, was Explaining School-Based Aggression, a Situational Analysis of Peer Influence. In her thesis, Laura examined the ways in which criminal propensity interacts with peer influence in bringing forth aggression in the school context. And the examiners praised the thesis for groundbreaking developments that span theory, method, and empirical findings, and for being clearly written and meticulous. And part of her work has been published now in the journal Deviant Behavior. Laura is, and I'm making a link in Dan's work, Laura is kind of like on a little bit on the line course persistent trajectory. She was already awarded the Manuel Lopez Rey Prize for graduating top of her MPhil year in 2017. In 2023, Laura joined the ESRC Centre for the Society of Mental Health at King's College, London, as a research associate. And in that role, she's currently coordinating the next wave of data collection for the Resilience, Ethnicity and Adolescent Mental Health Study, which is a longitudinal study of about 7,000, if that's right, about 7,000 young people growing up in London and better understanding mental well-being of young people as they grow, I think now into early adulthood. So I just wanted to congratulate her, and maybe if you could come forward, and I would be delighted to give you the award for. So this leads me now to introducing our speaker today, Professor Daniel Nagin. Daniel Nagin is the Theresa and H. John Heinz, I never know what to say, the third, Heinz the third, University Professor of Public Policy and Statistics. He is an elected fellow of the American Society of Criminology, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He is the recipient of the American Society of Criminologists Edwin Sutherland Award in 2006, the Stockholm Prize in Criminology in 2014, Carnegie Mellon University's Alumni Distinguished Achievement Award in 2015, and the National Academy of Science Award for Scientific Reviewing in 2017. Now, I think I could probably spend the next 45 minutes reading out various achievements of Dan's, and I'm not going to do that. But what I would like to do by way of introducing his work, I would just like to point out three achievements that, in my view, are particularly important. Dan has had and continues to have an exceptional impact on how we think in criminology and beyond on developmental patterns of behavior. This is partly methodological, but partly it's also theoretical and empirical. His group-based trajectory modeling methodologies, so it's not just one methodology, it's a group of different methodologies that belong together, have shown whether and how the development of problematic behaviors can be grouped in different distinct clusters and what factors influence the likely developmental group that an individual belongs to. This leads to research on the onset, the peak, resistance of crime and deviant behavior, but it also has had an enormous effect on our thinking, for instance, about the way in which interventions have an effect on behavioral patterns, the way life events have an impact on developmental patterns. So it's kind of like brought together a large part of the discipline around developmental and life course criminology. The second achievement that I wanted to outline here, if I find the page, but maybe I don't, but I remember what I wanted to say. The second achievement that I wanted to outline here is his achievements in deterrence research. For some interesting reasons, criminologists don't really like to engage with the question of how and whether deterrence works. And I think that has made a major impact in thinking systematically through the question of what deterrence actually means and in what ways, if there are any ways, deterrence actually does have an impact. So if anybody in the world asks questions about whether severity or probability of sanctions has an impact on crime, the literature to consult is Dan Nagin's work on deterrence. And also, if you want to think about the link between, for instance, formal sanctions and informal sanctions, extending this into informal social control, Dan Nagin has had a major impact on our thinking about this topic. And the third topic that I want to mention here, that's not a substantive area, but rather something about the way, in my view, he thinks, is his major contribution to clear, logical, and systematic thinking, and at the same time, transparent, good writing. I think if I ever, I do recommend to my PhD students or to MPhil students, what kind of papers give you a good sense of good academic writing? Just clear thinking logically, also not being partisan, but thinking through possible alternatives, and then coming to a transparent, logical conclusion about what matters and how to think about things. And then also linking this to the methodological question of how strong is the inference that we're trying to make? How strong is the evidence that we are basing our conclusions on? I think Dan Nagin's work is a paradigmatic case for doing this to the very highest standards. So I will finish here. We first met in 2003 when he was a visiting scholar here, and we had a number of fantastic lunches in the old building still. It was a much smaller building. I'm not going to go into this. I just wanted to say that today we'll talk about guardianship. That obviously has a link to this whole discussion around deterrence, guardianship, reactive and proactive. It's a key issue in criminology, namely how exactly members of society contribute to exerting social control in daily life. Dan, the floor is yours.
So let me begin by thanking Manuel for his very warm and probably exaggerated introduction to what I've accomplished. And I also want to thank Manuel and the Institute for the honor of being invited to give this presentation. Still, another point is that, as Manuel indicated, I visited here with my family, my wife, Risa, and daughter, Emily, who I think may be watching this. And the reason I visited was actually to draft my book on group-based trajectory modeling, which is not the subject of this lecture, but it was one thing that I think the three of us, that is my family, share is another reason I'm so happy to be here, is that all of us think of Cambridge as one of our most favorite places on earth to visit. So that's still another reason I'm happy to be here. And in talking about this work on guardianship, before I sort of get into the substance of it, the origins of doing this line of research that I'm going to be discussing this evening fall with it. I was about 3 years ago, had the great honor of being selected as a Locke's Law Fellow. And as part of doing that work, the work I'm going to describe has all been done in the context of the fellowship. One of the studies, which is actually the first one I'll be discussing, was done in collaboration with Tim Barton and Shana Herman over here, and another with a Max Planck director in Bonn. So I wanted to acknowledge that at the outset. So an explanation for the title. This work is, as Manuel indicated, I think of as an extension of my work about the deterrent effect of legal sanctions, the police, the courts, and corrections. But the sources of social control, I think we all know, go well beyond simply those formal sources of social control. And so in particular, here I became interested in the question of to what extent can private citizens, do private citizens play a role in preventing crime? And so by reactive guardianship, what I mean by that is the willingness of private citizens to intervene in some way to disrupt an ongoing criminal event. Or in the case of what we call preventive guardianship, the extent to which the presence of private citizens can prevent crime from happening altogether in the first place. And so that's what this is all about. So this idea that private citizens perhaps can play some role in preventing crime is certainly not a new idea, and certainly not a new idea with myself and my co-authors. I think it actually dates back to the Chicago School of Informal Social Control. And the literature on that dates back to the early 1920s. Actually, one other point I neglected to make in terms of my motivations for this is still another motivation for this, and I think it's important. It's certainly important in the contemporary United States, but I suspect also in Europe, but I say that with less certainty. Following the murder of George Floyd, and anybody who followed what was happening in the United States after that, there were lots of calls for what other sources of crime prevention can we look to beyond the police? And in specific, there was a lot of attention given to the role of private community members in the tradition of the Chicago School of Informal Social Control. To what degree, as a policy matter, can they contribute? And that was still another motivation. And what this literature, broadly speaking, focuses on are community level characteristics affecting the willingness and effectiveness of community members serving as guardians. So the literature, when you read it, focuses, as is most sociological level, on community level characteristics, like the level of home ownership, the proportion of the population that's immigrants, characteristics of the the overall environment. And so some early examples of this work are shown here. Probably, I guess, I'll defer to one person who I know is a sociologist here. Is that I think that one of the most prominent early examples is Shaw and McKay, and others are work by White. But more recent and contemporary examples of it, which I'll be talking about a little bit more in the moment, are Cohen and Felson's idea of routine activities theory, and a little bit later, Rob Sampson and colleagues' work on collective efficacy as an example of this. So just to sort of frame what I'm going to be talking about and the studies that I'll be talking about, let me just do a rough thumbnail comparison of collective efficacy, CE, compared to routine activities. In collective efficacy, guardians, as I'll be describing, play a very active role. They're being in trying to take actions to try to prevent crime and disrupt crime. Whereas in routine activities theory, their emphasis is more passive. It's just, it's, as I'll describe it, that the presence of people serves as an alert or not to a would-be offender about whether or not to commit a crime. I'm not here to try to sort out which is the better way of thinking about this, but the research that I'm going to be talking about is much more in the collective efficacy tradition, specifically of citizens taking in some fashion an active role in crime prevention. So just again, both of these theories, both of them all, I guess, again, the reflection of them being sociologists, again, focus on community level characteristics. So the central idea in the theory of collective efficacy, it focuses on the collective willingness of people in the community members in various ways to intervene and monitor what's going on in the community. But also it includes, sort of other, what I call more traditional measures of community characteristics that they feel are relevant to informal social control, like concentrated disadvantage in immigrant population and so forth. And as I said, routine activities theory tends to focus on guardian, what they call, as guardians, as just being present or not. So, an example of that in the original article on it, they were examining how trends in trends in homes being left vacant, mostly attributable or possibly attributable at the time that this work was done to women, at least middle-class women, more leaving the house, the household, being housewives and taking jobs, and therefore leaving homes vacant and making them more vulnerable to victimization. But still, in both of these literatures, largely not addressed is the decision-making that's going on between making process between would-be guardians and would-be offenders. And so that decision-making process has been the focus of both the research I'm going to talk about with reactive and proactive guardianship. So first of all, now the reactive guardianship literature. Again, to reemphasize, this is about people intervening to disrupt either a criminal or very problematic event. So there are two very distinct literatures on what we call reactive guardianship. One is bystander research from largely the social psychology literature. This is actually the older part of the literature, and much of this work stems from, I'm going to use the word alleged event, that in the early 1960s, there were reports of a woman, Kitty Genovese, who was raped and murdered in full sight of, this was in New York City, of many residents, none of whom intervened in either by calling the police or themselves, intervening. Since then, that account has been disputed, but the key here is what it did do, regardless of what actually happened. It triggered a long line of social psychology research on how, focusing specifically on how the number of bystanders to either a criminal or problematic event, how that affected their individual willingness to intervene. So that was its central focus. As an aside, since then, there's been a variety of literature reviews that call into question. The idea here was that the more bystanders there are, the less likely individuals are to intervene. And there's been a variety of things that have challenged that conclusion, in the context of at least of criminal events. And then there's still another very distinct and later literature, which is actually comes from criminology, which we call the guardianship in action literature. And among the different points that are important that literature makes is that in terms of intervention, there are many different forms of intervention that people can do. They can stand back and wait and see and then decide what to do. They can call third parties like the police. They can verbally intervene to try to diffuse the situation, or they might physically intervene to disrupt the event. And following that research, there have been quite a number of studies in which people most of this research is actually European research, some a lot in the NSCR, but elsewhere, where they view CTV recordings of criminal events and in various ways describe and analyze whether and how the circumstances seem to affect, who intervenes and how, and so forth. However, here too, for the most part, this decision-making calculus to serve as a guardian is largely unaddressed. In this research, we wanted to sort of dig deeper into what's the underlying motivation about whether and how one might intervene. And to do that, we examined, drew on several different literatures. One was literature on helping and altruism. So that was to get at beginning to shape together characteristics where, from a purely selfish point of view, why intervene? It's no skin off my back, what's happening. I mean, that's a narrow characterization of it. But this literature on helping and altruism, sort of begins to take apart the motivations for why, when we see others, we're willing to help, even though we don't personally necessarily benefit from, helping out in that situation. And then there's also a large, another literature, diverse literature on this situational decision-making. And in these contexts, one of which, it importantly does come from criminology, most importantly, I think I would find McCarthy and Hagen, on how safety considerations, personal safety considerations, shape decisions about, in their case, about whether to commit a crime or not, but is to intervene on these things. You're vulnerable. depending on how you intervene, to have your personal safety jeopardized. There's also, a literature on emotions, which we were actually talking about this morning, on how those shape people's behavior. So, for example, how angry you are, or how much moral outrage you feel at what you're witnessing. And then also, again, from the combination of the criminology and sociology literature on the social benefits and costs of intervening. Will you be praised, for example, by others, your peers and family, for how somehow intervening, or conceivably you could be criticized for it as well in those things. And so we did a study with Tim and Shana, Jean-Louis Vandegelder, who's the director of the Max Planck Institute in Freiburg, and none other than, again, Manuel and his colleagues at San Provo. So what you're seeing here is a picture, just a snapshot, is the work in Freiburg, where Tim and Shane are. They created this big virtual reality video involving that takes place in a bar, and the essential idea for our purposes here is the guys, the male, the blonde male, is the sort of the central character in this thing. You can best be described throughout the whole thing as just being obnoxious, okay? Behaving in obnoxious ways. And one of the obnoxious ways that he behaves is sort of really very aggressive on the woman shown in the video, where at this point he's inappropriately touching her. So what we did was we in the most recent, the 9th wave of data collection in the Zed Provo study, I'll briefly remind people of it here because I think most of you do know about it. Is the Zed Provo study is Zed is for Zurich. It's a study that actually Manuel was beginning to launch when I was still here, back visiting. And they've tracked about 1,000 Swiss individuals. They started in kindergarten. They're now in their mid, about 25 years old. And we showed them this entire video. And after they saw it, we began, asking them questions like, how likely is what their interpretation of this situation was? Was this guy out of line, basically? And different ways that they might intervene in different ways, and how about I'm listing here their emotions, how angry were they at what they saw, how their perception of if they intervened, whether they would be harmed. So this range of questions. We also took advantage of a variety of measures that were in the Zed Provo. Some obvious things like your willingness to intervene might very well depend on how big you are, and your physical prowess, but also Zed Provo. Again, I might be overly unnecessarily describing Zed Provo to this audience. It's one of its central focuses is on aggression, so that there's lots of different measures in the data set that are useful for adjusting that. So first of all, again, I didn't want to, the video is about a minute long, so I didn't want to take you through it. But the key point is, if you could just pick it up from the picture, is it was pretty universally recognized that this guy doing nothing wrong was completely out of line in what he was doing. If you see the whole video, I mean, that's not a hard conclusion to reach. And almost everybody, characterized it as inappropriate touching and harassing this woman, and many people even, characterized it as a sexual assault. So the point being is this guy crossed the line, and everybody, pretty much recognized it as such. So, and so this is some summary data. We gave them, we questioned them on 4 different forms of intervention that are listed there. And pretty much, overwhelming majority of the individuals in the study said they would either seek help, like the bouncer at the bar or something on those ones, or at least verbally intervene. And not as overwhelming there, but there were still quite a number of people who were willing to physically intervene, in this event. So what we did, analyses relating to these different forms, regression analyses of these different forms of intervention, and relating them to characters, to our data. So I'm just going to, so I can move on in the interest of time, just compare the models of seeking to help, what factors related to seeking to help, and what factors were related to physically intervening. So just to go through this thing, an interesting thing is that the people who indicated that they would seek help, we didn't make this mutually exclusive, but tended to have this high self-control, relatively speaking, and whereas the people who were intervening physically tended to have low more self. Another interesting gender difference is that males were much less likely to seek, third-party help, whereas females were more willing to do it. And keep in mind, in these regression models, we're also taking account of people's assessments of their physical, capacities and sense of safety. So that's going on. And then prosociality affected both, or was associated positively with both forms of behavior, and anger was prominent in both cases in a positive way. So the point being here is that without going into all the nuances of this, is that this study suggested that if you think about you're interested in the underlying decision-making process, to intervene in some fashion. That it involves, on one hand, some sense of what's your duty, a moral evaluation or pro-social. Do I have a duty to intervene in this context? Your emotions, the anger that people were feeling, also was positively associated with a willingness to intervene in some fashion. But there were physical safety concerns also weighed heavily, particularly in the intervening either verbally or particularly physically. They were concerned about that. And relatedly, people's assessment of their own physical capacity, to take care of themselves in these things were particularly strongly related to intervening physically. But the point, just relating this back in a way to my prior research in deterrence and so forth, is that we're thinking about this as a process of weighing costs and benefits. But in the context, in this context, what you call a cost and what you call a benefit is different. But there seems to be evidence of deliberate decision making. Going on. But, and this is the big but, by its very design, that is, asking the question, what would you do if you observed this event? How would you react? Perhaps be disrupted. That this form of analysis cannot address the question, can the threat of guardian intervention actually prevent crime from happening in the first place? And so, that brings me to my second study. Okay, the slides got out of order, so I'll begin by saying that the second study, which is a paper which we just completed, which I did with Christoph Engel. Christoph is a director of a Max Planck Institute in Bonn, right? And he is by background a lawyer and economist. He's very Christoph's work is very, very much in the tradition of the law and economics. And he, much of the research he does involves doing kind of laboratory experiments that we're going to talk about. And so, just beginning with the point of preventing crime in the first place has the benefit of avoiding both the costs of crime and the cost of punishment. So, in this paper, we asked the question: under what circumstances can guardians deter would-be offenders? So to design the study, which I'm going to describe to you, we looked at three relevant literatures. One was the bystander literature that I just talked about, because one of the actors in these things is guardians, that they're going to play this role of preventing issues of, an example of being a guardian who might prevent crime is joining a block watch. Okay? So you have to balance, the motivations, being willing to do this that might be associated, doing that. So the work that we've done previously was relevant. Okay. But there were two other literatures which are important to the way we designed this study. As I say, Christoph is from the law and economics literature. And an important strand of this work is research on the provision of what economists call public goods. So the risk of this is a public good, typically a private good. If I fill this glass of water and drink it, that means none of you can do that, okay? Or I buy an apple and eat it. That means you can't share in the benefit of doing it. But there are also, though, examples of what economists call public goods, where my consumption of that good in no way diminishes your capacity to already benefit. So that's a classic example of that is national defense. So we're all in this room benefiting from the Great Britain's national defense. We can each benefit from it without the other diminishing. But another example of this, quintessential example of this, is public safety. Perhaps with a little bit more qualification, but the safety in particular, now I'm thinking about the formal sources of it, is that the safety that the Cambridge police provide to all of us, we all can benefit from it without, without our benefiting from it, reducing other people. Now, in the case of, criminal justice system or national defense, the way we pay for these things are through taxes. So, but there are also examples where, a lot of important examples, where the provision of a public good requires voluntary contributions of community members. And when that happens, so for example, there's a classic example of this. As I was walking through Cambridge again, there's these common grounds here where you see cows, around grazing and so forth. And I would imagine at this point that all is very tightly somehow regulated, but I don't know. But it was certainly the case way back in the past where it wasn't publicly regulated and informal regulatory systems to stop overgrazing, had to be, somehow, accounted for. And in these situations, when you have to make voluntary contributions, there's a strong incentive to free ride. That is, not to make the contributions, let others do it, and then benefit from public good. And so, in the context of the guardianship, preventive guardianship, like contributing to a block watch or in other ways being vigilant, there's an incentive to let others take on the cost, which would primarily might have to do with safety and time, and benefit, still benefit from it. So that was important in the way of the experiment that I'm going to describe with design. And there's also a literature on experimental literature on the willingness of people to take personally costly actions to punish what they perceive as unfairness. So again, this is kind of the countervailing part. The idea of the public good problem is basically, which it is, it's coming from economics. It's kind of saying, if we put on the hat of us all being perfectly selfish, that creates the free riding problem. So the experiment we did this is a design of our experiment. And so I'll preface this by saying, I'll have to see if I can convince him that at the outset, I'm starting off the assumption that Charlie Lanfear is going to hate this. Okay? What we did. And so what we did was, we did this experiment on a platform. It's called Prolific, which is actually based here in Great Britain, and it has a worldwide access to participants, and it's specifically well designed for running the kind of experiments that we did. It has featured, so it's used a lot by people doing experiments. And we recruited people to this experiment, and they were randomly assigned one of the three roles that are listed there. Either to be what we call A-role participants, would-be thieves. By the way, in describing this all to people, we didn't put them, they were A, B's, or C's. There was no that kind of thing. But there would be thieves, there would be victims, and there would be guardians. And the way we set this up was that the A-role participants had the option. Everybody who signed up for this was given a 6-pound fee for participation. And the A-role participants had the option of taking 3 pounds from the bees and down. And the C participants, the would-be guardians, had the option of finding A if A actually takes. If she actually takes, then C makes a commitment of some sort, punish her for taking. But there's a cost to it because the fine that the guardian is going to exact comes from his endowment. Okay? So we make it costly for them to play this role. And so just to be clear, this is a pure example where C has no stake, financial stake, you know, in whether A or, you know, A decides to take or not. And in this experiment, the victim was passive. And so what we did was we also randomly assigned them to one of these 6 experimental conditions. I don't want to get into in detail. I want to point to a couple. In one condition, we had no guardian. Okay? It was just A and B, and A was said, hey, you want to take 3 pounds from B. End of story. With no consequence. Another condition, condition 2, the guardian had the option of finding a would-be taker by 3 pounds. So what that meant is, with that much punishment power, from the perspective of the taker, at worst, taking is a break-even action. You know, you have 6, you steal 3, and you get fined 3, so you're back to 6. Okay, so it's worse than a break-even. And then in the other conditions, we increase the maximum punishment power. Guardians up to 6 pounds, and all the way up to 9 pounds. And if you get fined 9 pounds, then the would-be thief walks away from the experiment with nothing. We would like to make that a negative number, but ethically, you can't do that. And then the fine to fee ratio, I won't just go through this quickly, is it meant that as we increase the fine to fee ratio, 1 pound could result in 1 pound of punishment, or 1 pound could result in 2 pounds of punishment. 1 pound could, result in 3 pounds of punishment, to sort of to amplify things. And so so that an important couple of points here is that, as I said, they were reported on. We did this on Prolific. Everybody was informed of their role and the condition that they were involved. So they knew all of those things. And because this was a little bit complicated at times, we actually quizzed them to make sure they understood what the payout consequences were for each of the participants. There was no communication among the participants. And the groups were created ex post. But the key point I want to make here is that the A role participant had to form expectations about, given what punishment condition he or she was in, they had to form an expectation of what might happen if they decide to take it. It was kind of mimicking deterrence, in the real world. Offenders have to form perceptions of what the punishment or the chance of getting caught might be, and the payouts all occurred ex post. So there's some of the key things that we measured in this experiment. One were, this is very much in, this is sort of an interesting side thing for criminologists, but in the law and economics literature, they are committed, it's a religious commitment in this literature to incentivize what people do. And so obviously there were monetary incentives that were related to taking or punishing the amount punished. We also elicited A's expectation, how much they would be punished if they did it, and we, the closer they got to a complicated process, the average of what most C's said they would do, they got bigger compensation. But more importantly, I want to emphasize, we use something called a social value orientation. Some of you may know. But basically, what this is all about, we gave them half a dozen or so options where they had to share, they had to make a decision about how much money they would get a participant. And in most cases, what that involved is that if they would get more money at the expense of a paired person getting less money. And so they were asked to make these trade-offs. So it would be saying, well, you'll get £5 and your paired participant will get £3, but you can get £10, but that means that your shared participant will only get £1. So to measure those trade-offs, we picked one at random, and that's actually what the payouts were. So, getting to the results. So this is showing what the taking rates were across experimental conditions. Now, one thing I want to note is that even in condition 1, where they could take with impunity, 30% or 32% of people didn't take. More of that in a moment. And then when you compare it to condition 2, where the guardian at best could make taking a break even action, there's no difference in the taking rates in that situation. But as punishment capacity increases, we are seeing deterrent effects. So we are seeing that if a guardian has sufficient punishment capacity, they can deter. Now, another interesting thing we did was we did a comparison of the takers versus the non-takers on social value orientation and a measure of the normative beliefs about the appropriateness of the thing. And what you see is a very, very sharp difference between the people who take and those who don't take. People who don't take had much higher social value orientation and thought it was inappropriate, much more inappropriate to take. Those underlying values that, for example, P.O. Wickstrom would predict are important. You're seeing in this. And then this is an analysis in which we broke people up between those who were above the median social value orientation, that were high social value, and then people who So these are the high social value, the above median and below medians. And what you see is that for people who are above the median, there is no, their punishment condition has no association with whether they take it or not. And so our interpretation of this, and I'll elaborate on this, is the reason for them taking is just inappropriate. And so it doesn't matter what the punishments are, because they think it's the wrong thing to do. They're not going to do it, no matter what the punishment regime is. It was the people who were on the low part of social value orientation, which is, by the way, I'm taking this as a broader indicator of a recognition of and respect for the welfare and property of other people, not specifically social value orientation. Is just a measure of that. What we see there is that's where the return effects that we were measuring were coming from that group of people who were not committed, basically, to respecting the property and of others. So this is another regression, a standardized regression, in which we regress whether or not a person takes or not on their perception of what the expected fine is, their social value orientation, and their views on taking being inappropriate. And so what you see from this regression, doing this regression, is that all three are statistically significant and negative. That is, higher expectation of punishment deters, higher social value orientation reduces the likelihood you take, as well as taking it. So they're all statistically significant. But another notable feature of this graph is that the magnitude of the effects of basically a normative position against taking, that the magnitudes of those effects are 3 to 4 times bigger than the deterrent effect in this. So some key takeaways. First of all is that guardians can deter crime if they have sufficient punishment power. And that there are people, the guardians, who are willing to take personally costly action to prevent crime. But that what I call respect for the welfare of others has a far more powerful preventive effect than the threat of punishment. And that, now I'll just say, speaking to Charles, is that we reviewed this as this experiment as being serving as a proof of concept. That guardians can prevent. So the next question is, though, which is a question of external validity, what does it recognize that this experiment is far removed from the reality, of guardians and actions in real communities? So let me frame the answer to this question in the following way. There, in 2023, a panel was organized in the U.S. from the National Academy of Sciences, doing title reports. And one chapter of the report was devoted to what do we know about the effectiveness of community-based anti-violence programs, where private citizens are choosing to serve as guardians. And The non-folded, for those of you who have had any experience with NRC panels, and I have quite a bit, so does Larry, is you learn to parse language. And words like suggestive but incomplete results are telling you that these are not very good studies. That are going on. And that there needs to be more of this research, but that it be evaluated in combination with strong evaluation designs in doing this. And this is the way in which, I'm going to frame this. How much time do I have?
That's a good question. Maybe 10 minutes?
Okay. So let me frame my interpretation of what these results mean in the context of Elijah Anderson's book on Code of the Streets. Okay? The introduction to for those of you who don't know who he was, I think he was a Stockholm Prize winner 2 years ago. Okay. He's an ethnographer. He doesn't run regressions and stuff like that. He's an ethnographer, and he begins the introductory chapter of this book, which takes place in Philadelphia. He takes a journey down Germantown Avenue. Germantown Avenue is a major artery in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia. And he starts us off in a place called, the community called Chestnut Hill. Chestnut Hill is mostly white, but there's also a sizable contingent, of Black population there. And as the picture is meant to depict, there's very little crime in Chestnut Hill. And what crime that does occur largely by outsiders. And in these communities, in Chestnut Hill, even if the neighbors don't know each other very well, they trust each other. And then as you go down in Eli's description, as you go down Germantown Avenue, and maybe Heather and Larry can better attest to this, because even though I was born in Philadelphia, but I left when I was 3, so I don't know the city nearly as well as you guys. The communities become poor and poor, and they end in Germantown. And I searched on the internet. Anderson's book appeared 25 years ago. And I tried to find a picture of what Germantown looked like 25 years ago. It was not successful. It was a lot worse than the best I could do, in my perhaps incompetent internet search abilities. And the point that Anderson makes that's relevant here is that in Chestnut Hill, there's no need for informal social control because of the nature, of the residents who, interestingly, I'm quoting Eli, is who he calls decent people. Okay? And as you sort of move down, and you wind up in German, is that the street people, compared to the decent people, have so overrun the community that any efforts of the decent bystanders, they're completely overwhelmed. So informal social control, in the way they talk about it in the Chicago school, just can't operate, in that extreme environment. So the question is, and this gets back to my thing, is trying to understand what are the circumstances in which it can be effective. So a couple, so we get with that. So the implications, I think, of our experiment for designing strong evaluation designs is I think that the starting point of any one of these evaluation protocols has to be a serious assessment of the group's capacity to prevent crime. I mean, by what theory does this intervention, now I'm thinking of organized groups, how do they think, I mean, they have a statement of how is there a rational reason for thinking that this could possibly be effective, which does not go, on in much of this research, in part because sometimes I think it's very, very politically motivated. The other is that the capacity of the group for crime control has to be assessed relative to the magnitude of the crime. So getting back to the Anderson thing is the capacity sufficient to address what's going on in Germantown, which I would say it would be not possible. But where in the spectrum can you expect there to be some success? Is the assessment also necessary, I think, to address this? In our experiment, cost to the victim was monetary. In the real world, it's not monetary. It's mostly it's time, how much time they're willing to commit. But I think most importantly, their safety so there has to be, and I think, an assessment of the seriousness of the safety risk to front citizens. And this is something that Anderson, heavily emphasizes, in his description. And a third component of it is, I would say, is identification of effective complements and substitutes for conventional law enforcement. And what I mean by this is, again, now harking back to, well, this is changing, but certainly in the immediate aftermath. There were people were arguing for types of interventions that were done completely independent. And there may well be circumstances where that's useful and valuable in different ways. But in other circumstances, and I think the focused deterrence literature gives some evidence of this, is that these citizen-led interventions need to be coordinated, with police activity, and figuring out ways in which you can make the two complementary. Again, an issue that's not been addressed in the literature. So, and then I'll finally make the observation, well, the purpose of this study was not to study the returns to early life intervention kind of program from the developmental neurology literature. But I think this experiment, when you compare the relative magnitudes of the deterrent effects versus people having an orientation of respecting the right to welfare of other people, very large difference in the impact. The purpose, broadly speaking, the purpose of these early life interventions is to hopefully to promote those kinds of the value of respecting others, in young children. And so I think It also serves to reinforce that whole literature articles the same. So thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much,